I think the research institutes are finding out right now there is no one size fits all when it comes to psilocybin. Now, we've known that for quite some years. And so there's a variety of different factors that go into determining the dose we give to an individual. There's very much the rational side of the equation. What's your condition? How acute is it? How long have you had it for? How strong is the psychological fortress? The non-rational side is the experience and the intuition. And so we end up working with very high doses. And frankly, when you're working with somebody in their 60s or 70s that's had treatment-resistant depression for decades, and these neural pathways, if you like, are very ossified, our anecdotal experience shows that the higher the dose, the more impactful the experience is. Yes, it can also be more challenging to deal with as for the individual and for the team working with them. But we generally see the more challenging the experience, the better the long-term outcomes are anyway. So it's exciting times to be working in the psychedelic space. I don't consider ourselves part of the gold rush. We were started way before the gold rush in 2014. So we're just keeping a very steady pace and growing slowly. And I think the results we're seeing from our longitudinal studies prove the efficacy of our therapeutic approach as well.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Psychedelic Conversations. We have Justin Townsend with us today. Welcome, Justin. It's a pleasure to have you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on your show.
It's a pleasure. Just to give a little bit of a context and your background to our listeners, I would like to say a few things about who you are and some parts of your bio, and we'll add all of that into the show notes as always, and some links and everything, your website. For now, I just want to give a little bit of a context to our listeners. So you are a very experienced advisor to startups, most recently in the healthcare space. You bring a blend of business acumen, leadership skills, and a nose for futuristic health models to the MycoMeditation team. You are the CEO of MycoMeditations, also a facilitator of the retreats. So this is the area that I would like to ask about a million questions to you, because I get so excited when somebody comes in, a guest comes in, and they have facilitated, thousands of, sessions in the type of settings that you provide. So before we get into that, please tell us a bit more about your background and what brings you to this space.
Certainly, thank you. Well, I would say that I'm not your typical psychedelic practitioner. A lot of those individuals are coming out of the mental health space now, so I'm not licensed. I don't have a background in mental health. My background for 25 years was in the corporate sector across a variety of different industries. But I was definitely a square peg in a round hole when it came to that work. I was pretty successful at it, but far too sensitive of an individual to be really doing supremely well in the corporate world. So my background, well, I suppose I had my first experience with mushrooms recreationally in my teens, scared myself a few times in the process. But at the same time, in my late teens, early 20s, I was suffering with chronic anxiety, chronic depression through a lot of my late teens, early 20s, and noted more by luck than by judgment that my psilocybin experiences had a positive impact on that. So I've always had a great deal of interest for the human condition, both individually and collectively, but of course, beginning with my own human condition. And so fast forward, I developed a meditation practice in the very early 2000s to about 2000, 2001. I had a very good friend return from an ayahuasca retreat in Holland. I'd never heard of ayahuasca. He said, "You must try this." That was my foray into beginning to work with the psychedelic underground in Europe using ayahuasca. That went from participating as a guest in those ceremonies to helping to facilitate those ceremonies. And so in that period of working with ayahuasca, I got to work alongside both some great shamans, some indigenous peoples, but also some great clinicians that were working the underground as well. Fast forward again, I moved to Germany. I started to learn holotropic breathwork, or a modality of that, went on to teach it, and then helped to host and facilitate 4-day-long breathwork retreats, then on to leading them. And then in 2017, I came out to MycoMeditations for the first time on a private retreat. Had a great time, got on well with the founder, joined the company as an advisor, then an owner, and then took over the company fully as CEO about 3 years, 4 years, about 3 years ago now. And so these two very disparate paths, the business one and the psychedelic path, crossed over, and things just naturally seemed to unfold on their own after that. And here we are today, I think, running one of the more longest standing and experienced psilocybin-assisted therapy treats with a Western contemporary therapeutic model, probably in the world right now.
Congratulations, and wonderful. This is great. Thank you so much for sharing. So you have a really deep understanding of the breathwork and then the transpersonal and depth psychology, right? Kind of as, is that like a holding ground that you provide, when you are assessing, when you're holding the space, bringing the medicine in? And you talk about in your bio, you say for groups between 8 and 12 on very high doses. What is that like? I mean, in a setting like that, very high doses.
Okay, so we have a range of different therapeutic modalities. It's very eclectic. Internal family system, somatic therapy, some CBT, some Gestalt type therapy. But all of that is really nestled or nested, if you like, within depth psychology. Okay. It's amazing to me how many guests we come that are seemingly the victim of their circumstances in life, whether it's addictive behaviors, maladaptive behaviors on the whole, or they find themselves cycling through the same relationship patterns with no idea why. And when you introduce the concept of depth psychology and unconscious behavioral patterns that began in early childhood, that became internalized and were brought into their adult lives, all of a sudden it empowers those individuals to begin to realize they can start to, if you like, take control in a good way, and start to recognize where those maladaptive behaviors and patterns came from and begin to replace them with something much more positive. Yes, we are known for high dosing because all of my team members have a great deal of experience. We dose personally ourselves about once a month. We'll have reached 2,000 guests served by the end of this year, 6,000 doses just within MycoMeditations. And frankly, I think the research institutes are finding out right now, or just of late, there is no one size fits all when it comes to psilocybin. Now, we've known that for quite some years. I can have a guest come here that's a male, 250 pounds, 6'3", take 3 dried grams and have a very powerful, quiet experience for 6 hours. An older lady or gentleman in their late 70s that maybe weighs 100 pounds wet may not respond to the first dose. You bump their second or third dose to 10 grams and it barely moves the needle. And after 2 hours, they're saying, well, nothing's happening to me, dear. And so there's a variety of different factors that go into determining the dose we give to an individual. There's very much the rational side of the equation. What's your condition? How acute is it? How long have you had it for? How strong is the psychological fortress? The non-rational side is the experience and the intuition. And so we end up working with very high doses. And frankly, when you're working with somebody in their 60s or 70s that's had treatment-resistant depression for decades, and these neural pathways, if you like, are very ossified, our anecdotal experience shows that the higher the dose, the more impactful the experience is. Yes, it can also be more challenging to deal with for the individual and for the team working with them, but we generally see the more challenging the experience, the better the long-term outcomes are anyway. So it's exciting times to be working in the psychedelic space. I don't consider ourselves part of the gold rush. We were started way before the gold rush in 2014. So we're just keeping a very steady pace and growing slowly. And I think the results we're seeing from our longitudinal studies prove the efficacy of our therapeutic approach as well.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for saying that out as well. Because currently, like all of us, we're observing a very different reality right now happening in the psychedelic space. There seems to be Do you know what is so interesting? I wanted to come back to the dose, but I just want to say this now that you mentioned it. It kind of feels like a lot of the people in the sort of trying to get or create, or at least kind of position themselves in the leadership front lines, there is a scarcity mindset still, that unconscious, typical, the competition, and then there's a scarcity mindset. It's kind of like brought to the psychedelic spaces as well. And I see a lot of the companies or organizations are in this very overstressed situation where they just want to dominate, and they'll just want to pump up all the research and the studies, and just there's a rush, like you said, there's a gold rush. And it's true, this is something that I've been observing. And yet sometimes I speak to so many guests that have been on this path 20, 30, 15 years, and they spent good amount of time with indigenous people out there in tribal community living, and they have a very different understanding. And I wanted to just tie this in with what you said. I always thought that it wasn't a dose dependent, and I'm not really agreeing. Also having a lot of challenges with our listeners and some of the people that email us about the dosing. Coming from a therapy background myself, I always believe that it's the person is the container. And I'm glad you said that. Yes, they can actually have a very powerful experience on a small dose. Doesn't have to be the flood dose. So I think because of what's going on out there, people are really fixated on the doses. And there is this, lots of misunderstanding, misconception, information out there. So how do you feel about that?
I think there's different dimensions to look at this from. We know that biopharma need to produce a very standardized product. And we know that the big pharma business model is, let's give somebody a pill every day for the rest of their lives, right? So there's a certain there's a way of looking at how this is monetized from a business model perspective on the pharma side. And to that end, they're trying to do things like, well, let's see if we can make the trip only 2 hours long, because that helps with our scale of economy, because the concept of having 2 licensed therapists with a patient for 7 to 8 hours doesn't stack up from a cost perspective, especially within the US healthcare system. And yet what they're trying to also do is remove the so-called adverse effects, as they call them, such as nausea, or the visual psychedelic experience, or the inherent anxiety that one can feel when they're having an experience. And yet, to me, that's almost throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So that's that side. I think on the people that are questioning the doses, look, undoubtedly, the higher you go up in dose, the probability of there being an outsized, externalized, powerful catharsis that needs some managing, that takes more than one person, is definitely there. And if you imagine that, many therapists are used to working one-on-one in their offices with people, it's a somewhat calm environment. Maybe if you've worked in a hospital, you're used to being around people that are dysregulated and off their bipolar medications and entering into a manic state. But even then, you have 2 nurses that will interact with that person and constrain them, etc. And so in the dosing space, we see a lot of emotional dysregulation. 30 to 40% of our guests that come down have some history of childhood sexual abuse or other very extensive trauma. As that's being processed and worked through, it takes a certain type of individual with a lot of experience and confidence to work in that space with somebody. So it's so I think the natural thinking is, wow, that the higher I go up in dose, am I going to be able to handle this and handle this dysregulated, disinhibited client that I'm working with? It's a fear factor. And so I can understand that perspective too. And yet at the same time, if you underdose somebody, they're going to be upset with you as well, because, hey, here I've come, I've really built myself up to this, I've got big expectations, and it's barely moved the needle for me. So that ability to find the right middle ground that takes the guest or the patient somewhat beyond their comfort zone, beyond what they think is their own capacity to manage this, is essential. And ultimately, there's an argument out there where the debate is, should a therapist be required to have their own experience with psychedelics before they work with somebody else? The ethicists would say, well, if you're a radiologist and you have to apply chemotherapy, do you really expect your radiologist now to be having an experience with chemotherapy, so they know what it's like? That's unethical, and I get that. But what we see is that a core dimension of a guest's capacity to heal here and go deep and really contend with what's in their shadow material and their unconscious processes is inherently linked to the connection and the faith and the trust and the experience they have of the practitioner they're working with. And frankly, I think the deeper the practitioner has gone in their own psychedelic work, the more deeper the work they've done with their own trauma, their own mental health disorders and issues, the more effective they are as a therapist. So that comes into play. Out there in the psychedelic world of myth, you've got the Terence McKenna concept of 5 dried grams in silent darkness is a heroic dose, and that's been laid down as some threshold that you should try and reach or dare to go beyond, right? Many of our guests typically may go, and this is not, maybe 5 grams in the first dose, 10 on the second, 15 on the third. That's not uncommon. It's not prescriptive like that, but that's maybe an example. When they go back home and speak with their family members and friends that have some experience, they say they're either not believed that they went that high. There's no way you did 10 or 15 grams. The most I've done is 2 or 3 or 4, and that was incredible, and it was really difficult for me. And yet that's very normal for us. And again, we don't just go up in dose because we feel like it. It's necessary to treat the individual that we're working with. So I understand these reservations, these different angles, and I think we're going to see over time this will start to clarify itself, and there'll be a happy medium reached. Although I do suspect the medical model and the one-size-fits-all and the limitations of the medical approach, the cool aloofness of medical practitioners, the power differential, don't contribute positively to the outcomes that could be generated. We look for a much more mutually equitable relationship with our guests.
Yeah, and this is a strong therapeutic model. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and we are research-based. Sorry, God. I was going to say we're research-based, evidence-based. We collect data. That data feeds back into how we analyze and do things.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That ecosystem of creating the loop and the feedback loop, and also seeing the real, the real hands-on in the field experience of many people coming in and experiencing, and then being with them, being with their experience. I think that's for me, it's the most powerful and valuable when it comes to working with the medicines. So the medical model is, if you look at the if you look at the psychiatry or the way that everything has been done, it's about helping people function, right? If you look at the clinical settings and everything, the one-on-one therapies and the traditional aspect, it's about keeping the client functioning and make sure we don't take them outside of their window of tolerance, which then the medicine work completely goes against that. So we need to take people outside of that window of tolerance. And that's when you said, that's when the container, the trust and report and all of these safety precautions come in place for the client to do the work. One question, do you think medicines always bring up trauma?
I would say that psilocybin especially, it's a DMT, whether smoke draw in the form of ayahuasca or 5-MeO-DMT or LSD. Psilocybin has particularly strong, what are known as psychoanalytical terms, reactive properties. So the ability to, if you like, search within and bring to the surface that which has the most emotional charge within you. All of that repressed memory and repressed physiological and emotional response to an early childhood trauma. So I see when I say potential, I would say has very high probability. It's more, we see it all the time. We're constantly helping our guests process trauma down here via an abreactive ability of psilocybin to do that then leads to catharsis. And so, I would say psilocybin, especially if you have trauma in your background, undoubtedly, we Many of our guests come to us knowing or having an inkling of understanding that there was something that happened way back when. I would say that recovery of abuse memories is very common, where when the trauma happened, the defensive mechanism of the psyche, known as dissociative amnesia, occurred. The memories were relegated to the unconscious. The body held on to the physiological and emotional response to the trauma. So we see both the memories coming back, as well as the body actually, through neurogenic or psychogenic tremors and convulsions, and whatever the guest is going through, is releasing that trauma as well. So it's not just the memories in and of themselves, it's the way the body and the individual is responding to that, and what they're processing at the time. So we can say look, there is some debate over what is false memory, what is real memory. I fully understand that. Our approach is do no harm. So we'd never say to a guest, because you recovered these memories, therefore it happened. We say, look, clearly you've experienced some kind of trauma that's evident in what your body's experiencing. We may never know where that came from or how or why, but we will work with you and help you release that trauma. And then on the other side, we see the outcome is what it is. Many of those guests will go back home if they've recovered new memories, speak to a sister, a brother, an aunt, or an uncle, and begin to better understand this hidden secret that was within the family the whole time that they never knew about. So there's that perspective, I would say, too.
That's just so brilliant. I was saying that's a very trauma-informed perspective. And, I am hearing lots of stories from people that they go to these retreats and they get told by facilitators that they are traumatized and that they have these memories now and they have to heal this. And like you said, there's a lot of suggestive stuff are happening that could also re-traumatize people. Again, there is also a pushback about, should we all be healing all the time? When does it stop? When do we get to the creative part? When do we get to the, explorative, conscious evolution part? When do we get to do all these other fun things? Right? I don't know if you get the same kind of comments, but right, what are your thoughts on that? We especially the medicines, psychedelic medicines.
Okay. I would frame that from a couple of different angles. First of all, what we say to all of our guests when they're on retreat, if you haven't realized already, you're not on vacation. This is work this week, right? This is the work where the healing happens. And so there are three mediators to the psilocybin experience. There are cognitive insights, there's the emotional breakthroughs, and the much vaunted mystical experience. About 40% of our guests get that mystical experience. We use the mystical experience questionnaire to ascertain that. A lot of healing and discovery is done here. There are a lot of peak experiences happen here. So if you imagine the peak experience, you get taken to the top of the mountain, you get to experience ecstasis, but you cannot exist at the top of the mountain, right? You've got to come back down again, put your backpack on, and get back into the normal grind of things. When you get home, the same assholes are going to be there. Some of the same challenges will be there. And so the work continues. If you've discovered that you have certain behaviors or maladaptive behaviors that were unconscious patterns, and now you want to make an active effort to change that and deselect certain individuals out of your life, have different relationships with people, that is work. That is work in going out there and practicing that. And in that is also the healing. And so I think there are big healings that happen. There are big discoveries and insights that occur, but then one has to go back home and continue the work. And that is healing in and of its own right. So when does the creativity come? A lot of creativity can be suppressed in early childhood. I mean, we know many people that had terrible childhoods full of abuse and neglect that either went on to become great visionaries and artists and overcame all of that, or as a child, because they were so creative, but their parents were neglectful or felt they were threatening or something like that, would have to dim their light. And they learned to dim their light. And they continue to dim their light into adulthood. And there what you have is what I would call golden shadow projection. Often when you're working in this space, and this is what we have to be very wary of, if a guest begins to have intense admiration for a retreat leader or a therapist, that's often a projection of their own golden shadow. And so it's our role to recognize the golden shadow as much as the dark shadow, educate our guest around that gently, and enlighten or illuminate them as to the potential that they have within themselves that's been repressed all these years. So creativity is not, to think if I do X amount of doses over Y amount of time, and you take this linear approach that if I do this, then the creativity comes. It's not as straight. It's much more of an arc than it is a linear approach towards this kind of thing.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Again, I always believe that the creativity and all the stuff that people are seeking are the byproduct of doing the actual work of, which I call the basement decluttering. I know it sounds a little bit.
No, it's spot on. You've got to shine a light into the basement and see what's there. Right? Yeah.
When people always ask me about, if I take the mushroom journey, or if I take which medicine, for example, will give me all the creativity, focus, clarity I need to move on from my life to my abundance. And I'm always like, okay, maybe you need to look at your basement and let's start there, decluttering, and then allow the other stuff as the byproduct organically just to emerge, right? That's kind of how I always saw.
Yes. Yeah, I completely agree. And I was going to say, occasionally, we do get artists that come down here, artists of all types, and they've had a prolific artistic career, but now they're stuck and blocked. So they already were able to tap into their creativity. Now they're stuck. I would say in those cases, psilocybin can unstick them very quickly, but that's because they already had this deep connection to their creativity already. So I'd say that's the exception, when maybe you can often get more rapid results, but somebody that just says, I want to be creative, I have a creative urge, but I've never expressed it, or I don't know what it is, maybe that's more work to get them there, and more of a circuitous route, an arc, rather than a linear approach again. Fascinating. I mean, my biggest challenge is always about how can we start focusing about putting things in order, in our lives. Can we just get things in order? Because there's so many things that are dysfunctional. We can't just bury our heads in the sand. And I really like the expression you said, if you haven't recognized it yet, you're on vacation. I think this is so true. Yeah.
I think in the Western model or Western lifestyles, somehow we have been convinced or believe that there is this perfect life somewhere out there waiting for us. So we need to get there. We need to, as quick as possible, as soon as possible, rapidly as possible. And one of the things that I'm seeing and observing is medicines becoming that, the desire to just take the medicine, take as much as you can every weekend and get to that place as soon as possible.
I say that the perfect life also maybe implies minimal or no suffering. And I think that is delusional. As we get older, especially at the midpoint in life and onwards, there's going to be crises that happen, healthcare, economic, our partners get sick, our children get sick, our parents get sick, we have to bury our parents. The pursuit of happiness does not insulate us from having to deal with all that suffering. It's inevitable that suffering comes. So it's much better that we have a more realistic approach. I would not want to be happy all the time. I mean, I think it was Kierkegaard, the philosopher psychologist, that said, if all we did was just sit around all day and eat cake and continue the species, eventually we'd all just get bored and we would create our own chaos. So there is this need for forward movement, for challenges, to overcome challenges, build resilience as we go. And I'd say that maybe the first half of life is very linear. You carve your place out in the world, you get your education, your career, maybe you get married and have kids. And there's good modeling for that first half of life everywhere we look. The second half of life, I think if people try and continue in that linear fashion, they're missing the point. I think the second half of life is more like a spiral, and you will undoubtedly come across the same or similar challenges that you came across in the first half of life. But because you are now more resilient, wiser, and you have grown, how you approach those challenges is very, very different. And therefore the outcomes are different. So I think that kind of feeds into this somehow this utopia or this ill-defined perfect life in my future that I think I want doesn't exist.
Yeah, spot on. Earlier you said a few things that I picked up about, your guests, participants in your retreat, sort of projecting their own unconscious or unaware parts of their psyche. How do you, as a team, how do you deal with the projections, the transference, the counter-transference that guests project onto your team? Like you said, you have a really strong team. What keeps you guys accountable? Like who checks who, and how does that work in your space?
Sure. Well, we do a lot of ongoing training. We have a clinical practice manual that goes from A to Z, as in when the guest first makes contact with our company, fills out application forms, looks at logistics. That's very important, all the way through their treatment throughout the week to when they leave, to the follow-up integrations we do on Zoom when they get home. And then, so that's the lateral, and then vertically down deep into each mental health condition that we're dealing with. Because obviously, if you're a therapist working back in the US or Europe, it's a combination of some kind of talk therapy modality along with a pharmaceutical of some kind, right? So you have to unlearn a lot, and the axioms underpinning that treatment modality change. So there's lots of education that we do. There's documenting and all of that. All of our team members are trained. We're constantly bringing new people in and training them up. We have supervision as well for our therapists throughout the week, where they can both be educated and deal with difficulties that came up for them, working with clients throughout the week. That's a very important part. Obviously, they're all very well versed in the nature of the unconscious mind, the shadow work, the projection, the golden shadow projection. They're doing their own psychedelic work. So whenever, we are lightning rods for people's projected anger. We may embody a parental figure where there's issues unknowingly. Sometimes you'll get erotic transference happening. And so when you recognize that's happening, it's typically a case of when the person is in the dose, they're not rational anyway. So there's no talking them out of that in the moment. And we don't do a lot of therapy with our guests while they're in the peak experience. It's about supporting them through it. And then really the ongoing therapeutic work is in the afterglow, but predominantly in the group therapy. And so a lot of if we come across some erotic transference, it's very simple. The individual reports it to the lead therapist, who reports it to the retreat leader, and then that person is extracted from that situation, replaced with somebody else. There are many, many different ways of dealing with that type of issue, transference or counter-transference or otherwise. But I think transference can be useful. It's not uncommon, even for our guests, to play unknowingly to them a reparenting role with another guest, with us there observing that happen. And so, a lot of people in the US especially that are therapists don't get to do group therapy very often. And unless you're working for the state or the government in a prison system. And so a lot of what passes as group therapy these days is a group of people sitting in a circle and sharing. Now, that's not insignificant, but it's not group therapy. The goal of that lead therapist is to tease out a guest's experience, work with the tension and dynamic in that room, to illuminate other guests around their own mental health conditions and their own narratives. And if that and the guests bond and connect very well in that process, and you may have a friendly father figure emerge out of that guest, that's where some positive reparenting can happen. So it's not vanilla how we do things down here. It's very dynamic, it's very instinctive, and it seems to work really, really well.
This is wonderful. This is exciting at the same time, because this is the kind of conversations we need to have. A lot of people, especially underground retreats, underground sessions or ceremonies, apparently full of these dysfunctional ways of handling the situations of like projections and then re-traumatizing people. And there's lots of lots of harm is being done at the moment because, like you said, when people are in the medicine, they are fragile, they're not in their rational mind, therefore all of their stuff come up.
Exactly.
And there is not enough education to handle those.
And the other problem is if you take somewhere like Oregon, that's made psilocybin legal now, all that's required to be licensed to administer psilocybin in Oregon is zero background in mental health, nothing whatsoever, no prior experience with a psychedelic, and all you have to do is 120 hours of classroom work and a 30 or 40-hour practicum, and then you are let loose. And to me, that is absolutely terrifying. And frankly, I think it's negligent. And we're going to see a lot of negative press come out of that, whether it's re-traumatization or maybe, one of the things we come across very often is these, what I call, this is an old fashioned word from the 60s, the psychotomimetic response. Psilocybin is a psychotomimetic. People can experience symptomology in the dose comparable with a psychotic break or mania. It can be paranoia, mild to extreme paranoia, to a persecutory complex, to I feel like someone's out to murder me, hypervigilance, complete loss of connection with reality. That can be quite acute. Dealing with that takes a lot of experience. And the risk of that kind of thing going wrong, because it's so prevalent, is also requires a lot of looking at. So what I'm talking about with Oregon is this is where state level legislators said this is an okay approach. And so that's why we have decided not to enter into Oregon or Colorado for that matter. We're going to wait and just watch them iron out the kinks, and hopefully there'll be a happy medium that they arrive at. But for now, to me, that's terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are your general observations with psychedelic renaissance that everybody's talking about right now? And maybe you can also link it to Australia now being the first country to legalize on prescription. So what are your thoughts on those?
Well, the gold rush is happening. That attracts certain personalities or personality traits, especially the cluster B type personality traits, those that encompass the narcissistic type traits and others, or the dark triad, Machiavellian, somewhat sociopathic, somewhat narcissistic traits that are there for the power, the shiny things. They fall in love with a reflection of themselves, right? In all the work they're doing. That's alarming to me to see these cluster B type traits turning up in leadership circles. What you often see, but this is uniform across many small companies, is that the psychological blueprint of the person that operates in a leadership role percolates down through the hierarchy. That's problematic without checks and balances in place, but especially so it's problematic in the psychedelic space. You've got big pharma piling in, small pharma especially piling in. You've got the whole cultivation question. Should we have a natural product that's cultivated? Should we have a synthesized product? What's the impact of the so-called entourage effect like we have with cannabis? Is it just that one molecule, or is it the association and the constellation of all these molecules and compounds together that impact this? You've got the situation where you're trying to fit this very unique medicine and the way it's administered into a pre-existing medical infrastructure and way of seeing things. And so I think it's a bit of a hot mess. I think there are very many well-intentioned but naive mental health practitioners and advocates out there. I think capitalism, I'm not anti-capitalism, but it's a beast. The job of capitalism is to turn everything into a optimal profitable unit. And so you've got capitalism meets well-meaning naive researchers and therapists who want to have a quote unquote heart-centered approach towards this work. But at both extremes, they don't work. You've got to find a happy middle ground. As you look at cannabis strategically, it wasn't the communes, the hippies, the users, the growers, all those people that put their lives at risk in the cannabis sector that made this available for mainstream. It was capitalism and operators and bankers. It's a bitter pill we have to swallow as well with psychedelics. It takes expertise to scale. It takes a lot of investment to scale. Within the psychedelic industry, you've got the medical proponents, you've got the therapeutic model proponents, you've got the decrim, the indigenous, the spiritual, those that believe everybody should have access to psychedelics and safety be damned. Within that industry, a lot of them are competing to be the gatekeeper. There's a lot of virtue signaling happening in there as well. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see how it shakes out. That may be different on a federal level in the US to a state level in the US. It will be different. I don't know how it's going to work in the UK. I am seeing the UK leaning seemingly more towards a medical model. I think that's a shame. I think you can have a softened therapeutic / medical approach to this that's going to deliver on really good outcomes and really good efficacy. But let's wait and see.
Yeah, brilliant observations. Thank you so much for being so open, transparent, direct, sharing these. I think these are the kind of conversations that I'd love our audience to listen to, because right now there are a lot of naive people out there, because since the psychedelic medicines are mainstreamed, we have a lot of people in a very, very desperate situations, very dire situations, and they desperately just kind of handing themselves over to anyone that says, I can help you and give the medicine. So very, very valuable.
Yeah. And that's not that's not unique to the Western mindset. I mean, if you weren't price conscious and you didn't do your if you were price conscious and you didn't do your due diligence, you can fly to Brazil or Peru, discover what you think is a shaman, but it's a local person that's brown, that's bought their ayahuasca from the market, has all the props and the headdresses and all the shamanic tools. And the same thing happens there. In the West, you tend to see more of what I call the plastic shaman. And they don't have anything in their lineage. There's no training. There's no background. There's no mental health background. There's an overconfidence in their capacity to do this work and to work with these powerful medicines. And that's leading to a lot of problems as well. Now, don't get me wrong. A lot of people can just simply rent a log cabin, go with a friend, have a reasonably low to medium dose of psilocybin, and there generally won't be a problem. But there's a not insubstantial portion of the population, and let's face it, we do have an acute mental health crisis in the West. It's getting more acute with every generation. You've got a lot of what I would call neurogenic or psychogenic contagion going on in the culture wars that's underpinned by mental health issues at the extremes. There's a lot of people that could very quickly get into trouble. So yeah.
Again, this is valuable, so valuable right now to have these conversations. So coming back to people who are desperately seeking for help because they've been in this suffering, pain, mental health issues for so many years. They've been on SSRIs, and now suddenly they see on Channel 4 or BBC or I don't know, Daily Mirror talks about this mom who microdoses and apparently stops SSRI. So that's becoming the new thing, the shiny object, or the new thing to pursue right now.
Yeah.
And I see again, we get emails, there's lots of people asking. And so that's kind of the expectation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My views have been shifting on microdosing. When I first heard about it, it was coming out of Silicon Valley in the West Coast of America and some of New York. And just the nature of the people that were hyping it and using it just kind of did not appeal to me. Another West Coast fad. Then I was at Horizons conference in New York, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and some researchers were presenting their initial findings. And they said, look, from what we see, there's a huge placebo effect here, especially if you go in with positive expectancy, and that the only clinically relevant application of microdosing from their perspective was maybe for ADHD, but more research is needed. Now, I do trust to a certain degree researchers. They come out of the ivory tower, they've got stringent controls, pristine studies, But I know that even in macrodosing of psychedelics, there's a big placebo effect at times as well, right? And yet there seems to be ongoing results emerging that seem to be much more effective at treating underlying not so acute mental health issues with microdosing. And I cannot ignore that. It's all anecdotal. It flies in the face of what research has said up until now. Yes, you've got to take into account the positive expectancy aspect, but I hear from so many people that are microdosing. And so I'd say the risk with microdosing is very, very low generally. But I have read in research that for some people that microdose, there is an increased probability of neuroticism and irritability at times. That's of a concern, but it's not a concern to say, well, don't do it. Our modality is working with macrodoses, and we deal with some very intractable and acute mental health conditions down here. But the great thing about psilocybin versus other psychedelics is it had what Roland Griffiths refers to as transdiagnostic advocacy. It has an impact on almost every category of the DSM-5. And so what we treat down here is depression in all its forms, especially treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, from social anxiety to end-of-life anxiety to generalized anxiety. We'll deal with a lot of PTSD and trauma, but we're dealing with also with cluster headaches, migraine headaches, alcoholism, OCD, fibromyalgia, and frankly, the results are just continually just blow me out of the water. So psilocybin has this at a macrodose level, the way we do things with 3 doses, not 1 or not 2, but 3 doses, from our perspective, is the right approach to dealing with quite substantial mental health issues. And what we're going to see, and what's going to be surprising for the mental health industry to get to grips with, is you're going to see a much shorter treatment cycle and not just good enough results or where somebody can now cope, much better than good enough results. You're going to see thriving and you're going to see flourishing. And to me, that's something that the mental health industry hasn't seen for a long time. I mean, I was listening to an interview, I think it was Christian Angermeyer from Compass or Atai, and I do follow this stuff, but he made some good points. I'm not a big proponent of small to medium-sized pharma, psychedelic pharma, but he said, look, how many times do you go to a dinner party or a cocktail party and somebody is saying, hey, I had these mental health problems, but SSRIs were amazing, you must try them. Ever, right? You never hear that. How often do you go to a dinner party now, but somebody says, yeah, I had some issues, I microdosed or macrodosed, you've got to try this, it really helped me. So the virality of this is big, and it might be that in the US and the UK, the medical model says you have to have tried the gold standard approach first, which is a couple of SSRIs. They then don't work. Now you're treatment resistant. Now you can try psychedelics. But I think there's going to be huge demand across the board. And patients will be saying to their doctors, no, I don't want to try SSRI first. I don't just want to manage my symptoms of depression or put a Band-Aid on them. I want psychedelics. And that grassroots pressure coming up is going to impact the medical level and especially the political level. And I think that's where the impetus is going to come from, I hope.
Yes, this is again brilliant. Thank you so much, Justin. You have just dropped so much into this conversation, so much wisdom, so much observation, and a really great perspective and more objective. Really appreciate that. So as we come into our end of our conversation, I would like to ask about your retreats. You provide so many different, you have so many different offers, so many different, valuable offers that you have. So how would you advise the guests to select and how they can select the best one for themselves? Because you said you're dealing with all kinds of severe to, depression, to all kinds of trauma related issues.
Okay.
How would you, because our listeners would be interested and then they would want to listen.
Well, it just so happens, and I'll send it to you, that I wrote an article about this a few weeks ago. So what should you be looking for when selecting a retreat, right? Because you've got a variety of different medicines available: LSD, iboga, psilocybin, DMT, NN-DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, ayahuasca. What is the medicine of choice is the first maybe one of the selection criteria. Do I want an underground model? Do I want one-on-one? Do I want a more exotic shamanic approach towards this? Maybe a neo-shamanic approach in the UK, maybe a more traditional shamanic approach in Brazil, or do I want a contemporary therapeutic model, right? That's the next level of selection criteria. Then am I going for wellness? Am I going for a mental health issue? You will find that a retreat like ours, for example, we have a psychiatrist on team. We don't go above 12 people. We have a ratio of roughly 1 team member for every 1.5 guests. The majority of our team are licensed therapists, also with hundreds, if not thousands of hours of psychedelic experience working these retreats under their belt, versus a wellness retreat might be more 15 to 20 people, only 1 or 2 doses, whereas we do 3. There may be 1 psychotherapist if you're lucky for the whole group, but then you've got a yoga teacher in there or a sound therapist that likes to play jazz in their spare time. Maybe the protocols are a little bit more relaxed. So it depends upon, now for us, safety is our first priority, and then the correct application of our expertise with this medicine to deliver the best outcomes. That profit motivation is going to be different across different companies. And so there's many, many different criteria. For me, I would say, hands down, in the majority of cases, psilocybin, macrodosed, 3 doses, not 1 or 2. You don't want to come all the way to Jamaica and you don't launch on your first dose. They dial in the second dose and you're just beginning to do the work, right? 3 doses, I think, is the way to go. And a Western contemporary therapeutic model, I think, is understandable and fits within most people's wheelhouse of understanding. I think one of the problems we're facing as an industry is we need to develop a vocabulary to talk about this psychedelic experience as it pertains to psychology that everyone can get. I don't think it's the shamanic model. I don't think it's the medical model. I think there's an in-between that we have to find that language for, and that'll come in time as well. So I will send you a link to that article so you can share it with your listeners, and it's quite comprehensive.
That's brilliant and valuable. Thank you so much again for everything you do, Justin, and your team, and your vision, and this mission is very, very valuable and powerful. Just quickly, what are you working on right now? Projects, anything that you'd like to share with our listeners? I'm sure we'll have your website, but if you want to say where they can find you.
Certainly, they can find us at MycoMeditations.com. Myco is MYCO, comes from the word mycology, with mushrooms. What are we working on? Well, I mean, we'll have done 50 retreats by the end of this year. So a lot of it's just running the business, training people, finding new people, bringing them in. That consumes a lot of our time. We're working with a few esteemed research institutes to look at how we can publish our data with them. We are watching the psychedelic industry with interest. I'm especially interested in the UK, given that's where I hail from. How are we going to bring this more to people's attention and get a working model there? We are going to remain boutique. We are not going to become the McDonald's of psilocybin therapy. We're very focused on high quality outcome, high quality experience. By the way, to your last point about how we run our retreats, we've got 3 different price points. So there's something for everybody. We have a more rustic model on the lower end. We have a comfort model in the middle, then a concierge model at the top. The quality of the outcomes and therapy does not change according to what you pay, but obviously the food and accommodation is what changes. So if you want a more luxurious experience, you can go for that. So those are the things we're working on. We're going to expand into the US eventually. We may end up in Holland, who knows? But we are limited with working with truffles there, and that there are some other restrictions with Holland. But my ultimate goal is to bring this to my fellow countrymen and countrywomen back in the UK.
Very powerful indeed. Yes, that's such a pleasure. And to have this conversation, being in the UK and seeing more of our UK, fellow UK people out there doing great things. So thank you, and thank you for your time. And I'm sure we'll have you back in the future to follow your journey and what comes and unfolds from your projects, from your current projects.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me on your show, Susan. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. Don't forget to get in touch, leave a comment, reach out to myself and Justin. We'll have all the links. Don't be shy, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye for now. Thank you so much for joining us. Psychedelic Conversations podcast is designed to educate, inform, and expand awareness. For more information, please head over to psychedelicconversations.com. You can also share with your friends or leave a review so that we can reach more people. You can also join us in our private Facebook group to keep the conversation going. This show is for information purposes only, and it is not intended to provide mental health or medical advice. Thanks for listening.